All right, and we still have a few people arriving, but we'll go ahead and start. My name is Bob Hendricks. I'm the chair of the Austin Executive Committee of the Sierra Club and also the chair of the State Sierra Club. And I am delighted to introduce Peter Fiekowsky as our speaker this evening. As we all know, the climate crisis is not settling at all. It's getting worse, and we've got to do something about it. And I was very impressed by his books that I bought and read recently. And so he is the author of that book, which is called Climate Restoration: The Only Future That Will Sustain the Human Race. He's an MIT educated physicist and a Silicon Valley entrepreneur and philanthropist with 27 patents. He has 30 years experience as a citizen lobbyist for poverty and climate issues, and over the past decade has been working to build the organizations required to ensure the survival and flourishing of humanity. Fiekowsky's mission is to leave a world we're proud of to our children, and to that end, he's founded a number of organizations, including the Foundation for Climate Restoration, Methane Action, Stable Planet Alliance, and others, working to restore a sustainable population, and the Interim Climate Restoration Safety and Governance Board. I met him about 5 years ago in DC, and he is definitely someone who has been working hard and passionately to try to stop our climate crisis. So go ahead, Peter, and take it away.
Great. Well, thank you, Bob and Bruce and all 61 of us here. It's a privilege to talk to Sierra Club. This is my first talk with Sierra Club, and you have a powerful organization. Was it 3 million, 6 million members now? How many is it, Bob?
I think we have 3 million.
3 million. And so you're the first ones to hear the talk about climate restoration. As Bruce said, I found him about 10 years ago. I'll tell a little bit more of the story about how that happened, but I'm really appreciative. Bruce was my first outside colleague saying, you know what, we need to get the CO2 back to levels that humans have actually survived long term. How come we're the first ones to talk about that? And so this was 2013, and CO2 hadn't even gotten up above 400 by then. So let's see. So as Bob mentioned, I'm a MIT trained physicist. I'm a grandfather. I was just inside the house playing with my grandkids. The two younger ones are 1 year old, and they pull the books off of the bookshelf and they put it back, and then they put it on the floor. They put it somewhere else. It's just delightful. And I'd love to talk about them, but this really isn't about my grandkids, except that it's really about all of our grandkids. Climate restoration is our way of saying that playing Russian roulette with our kids and our grandkids is simply immoral. And I think almost everyone on this call is aware that 350 parts per million of CO2 is scientifically recognized as the highest that humanity as we know it can survive. And of course, we passed that 35 years ago. And it was 350, and it's now 420 parts per million. And so I don't know, well, it's a fluke of history why we're all working to merely stop emissions and stabilize greenhouse gas levels 100 parts per million, which is the best we could if we simply follow the UN guide. And I think for every one of us, that's simply not acceptable, that we would give our children a climate where CO2 is 50% higher than humans have ever survived. Like, that's crazy. So how do we restore the climate? So let me show you some slides. So this really is about my grandkids and your grandkids. And go to share screen. And there, there, and slideshow. Let's try it again. There we go. Okay, so Bob, do you see it?
Yes.
All right. So climate restoration for humanity flourishing, aka our grandkids. And most of the climate work is about us. How do I make money on carbon removal and carbon reduction? This is about the world and our kids. I've got just 3 points and obviously a few details. The first one is a bit shocking because we always think of climate as having opposition. We all want to restore a safe climate, one that humans have actually survived long term. This pre-industrial climate had CO2 levels around 280 parts per million. Now, I read many times that for people to absorb the most information, it actually works to see and read at the same time. So there aren't many words on this, but please accept that I'm going to read most of the words that I do present. First is, so we all want to restore a safe climate. There's no opposition. I've asked all over the place that no opposition, from the far left to the far right. Now, there are people who argue, but they argue for the sake of arguing. We all want to restore a sustainable population as well, similar to what we had 100 years ago, because we want to sustain humanity. Because here's the thing is, once you grasp that we actually have everything we need to restore the climate, you say, oh my God, well, what about the fact that population is 10 times higher than anything our planet has sustained long term? The answer is, you know what, we can actually deal with that. The short story, one sentence, is that to get to a sustainable population by the end of the century, well, by the end of the century, almost everyone alive now will have died natural deaths. And it's just about the number of births. And if you read the news, people are having small families. People are having 0, 1, and 2 kids most of the time around the world. So that's going to get handled, and that's going to be probably the last I say about population. It's not that big a deal, and the key is to know where we want to go. We do want a sustainable population. And here's the interesting thing. You won't find notes about achieving a sustainable population in the UN yet. And this is one of our campaigns. So number 3 is really interesting. We have the technology and finance to achieve both goals now. We have the technology and finance. What's needed is courageous leadership. And that's why I really appreciate you guys inviting me to talk to Sierra Club, because you are some of the top leaders in climate. And now I have to get this to go to the next. Oh, there we go. So a few definitions. Climate restoration means restoring CO2 levels that humans have actually survived long term. The highest level humans have survived is 300 parts per million, and doing that while we still can. And 2050 is the commonly accepted limit beyond which our ecosystems are falling apart. Bruce will tell you about that. And you may have noticed our political systems are falling apart, our social systems, our climate systems. So that's 2050. To restore the climate will require removing 1 trillion tons of legacy CO2 from the atmosphere by 2050. And that requires removing 60 gigatons of CO2 per year between 2030 to 2050. So we'll scale up in the 7 years between now to 2030 and then run full bore for 20 years. That may sound crazy, and we'll talk about it, and you'll probably ask me a question about it as well. Now, here's the interesting thing. Did you know that nature's already removed that same 1 trillion tons of CO2 10 times over and over in the last million years, and did it preceding ice ages? So we can use the same process, faster, of course. And there are other methods as well that I'll discuss briefly. And finally, climate restoration requires investing about $2 billion a year, and that will restore CO2 and restore methane. And you say, wait a minute, if it only is $2 billion a year, why aren't we doing it? Well, that's the question of leadership. And we can and will do both. And oh, okay. The slide I hope was in here is the main issue is this, is the UN goal for climate, as you probably know, is to stabilize greenhouse gas levels. That's their goal. It was a really good goal in 1990 when they established it, because CO2 is at safe levels. Well, CO2 is now 40% higher than humans have ever survived, and that's no longer safe. So we need to update the UN goals. And the reason people aren't investing in restoring the climate is it simply goes against what the UN said back in 1990. So this is a graph that most of you have seen before many times. This is CO2 levels over the last million years. And we're here, actually, we were here about 5 years ago when I made this graph. We're up here now. The Paris goal is at 460 parts per million. One thing you'll notice is that the highest level humans have ever survived is 300 parts per million for this brief point, 350 million years, 350,000 years ago. Humans evolved either in this warm period or this one, depending on who you ask. And you'll see that the UN goal, again, in 1990, we were just here. It was not that far above the highest humans that survived. And it was reasonable that the scientists said, you know what, if we stop emissions right now, we'll be okay. And that's what they said. We're here, and it's crazy talk. Like, have you ever heard, think about this, have you ever heard an expert say that if we stop emissions, that we will have a decent chance to survive? You've never heard anyone say that, not since the 2000. The CO2 levels are too high. And so, the work that I'm calling on all of us to do together is to get legislation, get congressional resolutions, get President Biden to declare that we are actually committed to restoring the climate for our future generations. And that'll be a breakthrough. Now, here's the other important thing in this slide is you can see the last ice age was here 12,000 years ago. So imagine a mile of ice over New York City. And we're here. This is the 12,000 years where we developed agriculture and civilization. And of course, we boomed the CO2 since then. But you can see that the amount of CO2 we need to get out is roughly the same that nature has taken out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times in the last million years before the ice ages. So we don't have to invent something new. All we have to do is do what nature did. And many of you have heard something called the iron hypothesis, because, and I'll tell you about that in a second. If you look at this, nature takes out CO2 over about 50 or 100,000 years, and then releases the CO2 back into the air, usually pretty quickly, pretty suddenly. And if you think about it, it's not rocks. It's because rocks can't release CO2 that fast. It's not trees, because trees don't last 100,000 years. It's photosynthesis in the ocean, where the plants that grow in the ocean and the animals that eat them sink into the deep ocean, where there's almost no oxygen and they don't rot. We all love trees and we should keep planting trees, but we all know that trees die after 50 or 100 years and they die and rot and burn. And the CO2 goes back. They're great short-term storage, but they're not long-term. They're not what nature does to remove 1 trillion tons. What nature does is in the ocean. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So keep in mind, we're just going to do what nature has done and do it efficiently. The thing to remember is when nature does this, it doesn't have any physicists, chemists, computer programmers, no CFOs to do economics, no banks. It just does it randomly. And we have all these things. We can do it much more efficiently. Okay, another important graph, very easy. This is CO2 over just the last 12,000 years. So they call this the Holocene. And you can see the CO2 coming up after the end of the last ice age, and nice and stable, Moses, Jesus, and then kaboom, we go up exponentially. Again, 300 is the highest humans have ever survived. This is our safe harbor. And so the thing to remember is when a ship is in stormy seas, the captain will take it to the nearest safe harbor where he and the ship have been before safely. And there's probably a PhD on board who said, listen, I just ran some modeling in my computer, and I think there's an island over to the left, which we might survive. And the captain will say, that's great. If I can, I'll leave you off at that island. We're going to this safe harbor where we have been for thousands of years safely. We're not going to play Russian roulette with our grandkids, where it's just not moral. We're not going to do it. So remember this graph. This is the safe harbor right here where we've been. It's not where UN wants to take us up here. It's not 350. 350 is not too bad. We want the safe harbor because we're adults. We're parents. Okay, so now how do we do this? So nature uses two methods: photosynthesis in the ocean and limestone. Now, if you listen to a lot of the climate talk, they'll say to stop emissions, there's no silver bullets. There's only silver buckshot. Now, that's true for energy conversion, right? You have to deal with cars and power generation and efficiency. It's everywhere. When it comes to CO2 removal, nature has two silver bullets, just two, that are up to the scale. Photosynthesis in the ocean, because the ocean's huge. It's 75–80% of the whole surface of our planet. And the other is a limestone. I didn't show a graph about it, but limestone is holding right now 99.9% of the carbon on our planet on the seafloor, which has accumulated the skeletons and shells of plants and animals over the last 100 million or 200 million years. So it's in nature very slow, but limestone by weight is half CO2. And so that's where 99.9 of all the carbon on our planet is now. What's nice is that we can duplicate both of these, the photosynthesis in the ocean, not over the whole ocean, just in the right places and the right times. And when you do that, that produces the green that grows, the algae, is food for fish. And sometimes it also, you can grow seaweed. And you want to do it the right place. But by producing fish, that's good for the fisheries and good for the fishermen and fisherwomen who are catching the fish. And so that can actually, the fishing is more than plenty to pay for the work to duplicate the photosynthesis. And I'll talk about how they do that. And that's what the iron hypothesis is about. And the second limestone, the synthetic limestone, and I'll only talk about it briefly because I don't want to bore you too much, but this is an example of synthetic limestone. They make it either from CO2 from the air, which is what they're doing now. Normally they do it using CO2 from a power plant, but the power plant they were using is under repair. So they're just sucking it out of the air instead right now. And as I said, limestone is by weight half CO2. They sell that to companies. San Francisco Airport is their main customer right now. And they use that carbon sequestering concrete in their runways and their terminals. The point is that it works. It's tested and they're scaling it up. They're scaling it up by a factor of 10, I think, in the next 6 or 10 months. Just amazing. And there we go. Okay, so let me do a little bit of theory here. So climate restoration, you've probably heard of many carbon removal techniques. Direct air capture is very popular, and all of them are very good. There's a field of carbon tech, where you're pulling carbon out for industrial use. So direct air capture is mostly used, well, in Texas, direct air capture is used to capture CO2 that they pump under into oil fields to push out more oil. And that makes that oil carbon neutral. I'm talking to a lot of Texans, so I'm not going to say anything derogatory about oil. I know maybe most of you aren't big oil fans, but we're not. We'll pretend you're good Texans. And but some of it's used for fizzy drinks. Some of it's used in greenhouses and so on. There's a lot of use for carbon from the atmosphere, but to be a carbon restoration solution, it has to be permanent. The CO2 stays out of the atmosphere for at least 100 years. The method must be scalable up to at least 25, hopefully 60 billion tons of CO2 a year. That's a lot, but there are solutions. And it has to be financially viable. The thing is that there are a lot of solutions out there. And if you're like me, you get news items across your computer every day about new techniques for getting CO2 out of the air. But they have to be viable. There has to be funding for it at the 25 billion tons per year scale. So just to put it in numbers, if you just use round numbers, 10 billion tons per year at $100 a ton, which is really the optimistic goal, is $1 trillion a year for the standard CO2 removal methods. And no one has a budget of $1 trillion a year for carbon removal. However, for the nature-based ones, the ocean photosynthesis and the synthetic limestone, those pay for themselves. So their cost is $0 per ton to the public. And so those are definitely financially viable. Now, people ask me, well, are there other possible solutions beyond the four that I'm going to talk about? And the answer is, well, there might be, and I certainly hope there are, but it's been about 5 or 6 years, and this list has not changed. So being a sensible parent, I said, well, let's bet on the chips we have on the table and not hope that and not wait until something falls out of the sky. And if something falls out of the sky, that's great. So the big four solutions are permanent, scalable, and financially viable. And the first one is ocean iron fertilization. This is the iron hypothesis. And I'll come back and describe it. So synthetic limestone, seaweed, which is a variation on the ocean photosynthesis. And then methane oxidation, I'll talk about if we have time at the end. Very, very important, highly leveraged, but a little bit arcane. So the idea with the ocean iron fertilization is, yeah, I love the ocean. I love the blue ocean. In the picture here, you can see the beautiful blue. The trouble with blue ocean is that it's not green. Green means that there's photosynthesis happening, that all the nutrients required to create the algae or the phytoplankton is there, and it's growing and providing food for fish. Iron fertilization is the method which it turns out that most of the ocean on the planet is blue, which is beautiful, but it's not green. And so how do you turn blue ocean green is with a missing nutrient, which is iron, in phenomenally low amounts. And you might say, well, why iron? Well, iron doesn't dissolve in water very well. And so it tends to sink. And the only way that the iron gets into the ocean is in dust storms. Dust storms. Well, think about this Sahara Desert that's with the pink dust. The pinkness is iron oxide. And when that blows across the Atlantic, for example, it provides the iron needed in the Atlantic to grow a lot of seaweed. And if you've heard about the, oh my gosh, what's the name of the seaweed that's clogging Miami and the Caribbean?
Sargassum seed?
Sargassum, yeah. So you get all the sargassum growing. Why do you get the sargassum growing? Well, in large part, it's because you have plenty of iron blown from the dust blowing across the Atlantic. And it's also because you have phenomenal amounts of other nutrients coming from the farming that's beginning now in Northern South America and the Caribbean. Anyway, so iron fertilization, the way it's implemented is to really duplicate how nature does it. Nature does it locally and intermittently. So you don't do the whole ocean. And people often talk about doing the whole ocean. No, that's crazy, because that will transform the whole ocean. You don't want that. You want to do exactly what nature's been doing for millions of years with a dust storm. But rather than blowing dust, which is hard, the ships that do it simply take the amount of dust, which is incredibly small. It's about per square meter, per square yard, it's about 1/100th of a teaspoon. So just a few grains of just very super fine dust, so fine it doesn't sink, is all it takes. And they just mix it with the seawater as if it was dust that landed. And within a few hours, it starts turning green. Within a day, it's green. Within 2 or 3 days, there's fish coming. Somehow the fish have a way to hear the phytoplankton growing. No one understands it well yet, but it makes sense that over the billions of years we've been here, or millions of years, fish would have figured that out. So the fish come, and then when the fish come, the seabirds come, the whales come. It's a cacophony of animals that show up. And what they found, they've done 13 tests of this. Only one of them at scale. The one at scale was 11 years ago in the Gulf of Alaska, and I'll give you some data from that in a second. But it'll remove the CO2 will go down from 400 parts per million to 300. It'll reduce it by like 25%. Just amazing, because there's so much photosynthesis going on, at least during the day. At night there's no sunlight. And so this is a picture from 2012 of the salmon that was being caught. Just phenomenal. That their salmon catch was 4 to 5 times higher than they had expected from the previous year. And what's interesting is only 1% of the ocean area is needed to be periodically fertilized and restored. And they do this in eddies, which are just circular currents found all over the ocean. And the circular current keeps it localized. So you're only affecting a little bit of the ocean. After 6 months, it all dissipates and it washes back to normal, because all the normal flora and fauna are around. They call it ocean desert when it's blue, though, because it's not dry, but nothing is growing, just like it seems like nothing's growing, just like in a land desert. Now, when you look at, here's some of the data, and the 2012 project was called the Haida Salmon Restoration Project. They used 100 tons of iron dust, and in one ocean eddy, about 100 miles in diameter, and the pink salmon catch increased more than 4x the following year and every 2 years after. And you can see that in this graph from the Alaska Fish and Game Report. This is from 2020. And you can see they did the fertilization with 100 tons of iron dust. In 2012, the next year, skyrocketing pink salmon. I like they used pink for the pink salmon. And then the pink salmon has a 2-year life cycle, and you can see it decaying because they never repeated it. And the reason they never repeated it is the environmental community was taking the UN literally, right? The UN said, our goal is to stabilize greenhouse gas levels. And a lot of people said, well, wait a minute, if we restore the CO2, how are we going to pressure ourselves and pressure the oil companies to stop selling us oil if the CO2 is fixed? And so there was a big campaign in 2012, smear campaign, to say it was illegal and so on. Anyways, so no one ever tried it. since, although it's likely it'll happen in the next year or two, because we're all getting much more sensible and realize, and the UN says now we have to remove CO2. And so the people who were opposed to removing the CO2 in 2012 are much more rational now. One thing you can see here, these numbers are the Canadian fisheries and oceans data. Their coastline is a little bit different. You can see in 2008 there was a volcano, and that year the pink salmon catch was 224,000, 250,000, and then went up to 10 million after the volcano, which happened to be at the right time in August, right? Because you're not going to get photosynthesis up in Alaska in the winter. You're only going to get it in the summertime. So it was in August, and you got a big boost. And you can see again, it went down, went back up, went down, and then went back up again in 2013 after the height of iron fertilization, and so on. The point is it works. And now this is interesting, especially for the people who like looking at graphs. If I were in person, I would ask you how many of you recognize the Keeling curve here. So this is just from 1980 to 2020, and I just took a ruler and drew the baseline from 1984 to 1991 when Mount Pinatubo erupted. And Mount Pinatubo dumped an enormous amount of dust, including iron in it, into the ocean around Indonesia and the Philippines. And then you can see that the baseline, the CO2 kept on going up at the same rate, except it was offset by 25 gigatons, 3 parts per million. 25 gigatons of CO2 were absorbed after Mount Pinatubo. Now, this is in parallel with the fact that the planet cooled. I'll show you a temperature graph in a minute where you can see the cooling, and you can also see the CO2 removed after it. Now, what's interesting is that you can't find any scientific reports about this. It's right there in the data. You see it every time. And I pointed out to Keeling's son, and I've forgotten the guy's name. He's also at Scripps. He said, yeah, Peter, I've been writing a report about the correlation between emissions and the rise of the CO2 emission, CO2 levels. This is atmospheric CO2. But he said, yeah, we did notice there was a permanent loss of about 25 gigatons of CO2 after Mount Pinatubo. But he said, yeah, we didn't really care because we're talking about emissions, not removals. Again, the point is our job is to get the UN to talk about removing and restoring CO2. The scientific community has not been charged with answering how do we restore the climate yet. And we need to change this by the end of this year, hopefully by the end of COP in November. Very cool. Biggest day. Okay, quickly about limestone. This is the White Cliffs of Dover. What's interesting is if you add up just the White Cliffs of Dover and about 1 kilometer inland or 10 kilometers inland, that's enough. That's enough. The amount of CO2 that we need to remove. So it's not a whole hell of a lot. And then the point of the clamshell, the oyster shell, is making limestone is not rocket science. A little oyster will do it. And this company in Silicon Valley has essentially replicated the chemistry an oyster uses. They do it in a much simpler way, just because they do have the advantage of laboratory science. But this limestone they make is competitive with quarried limestone here in California, because for environmental reasons there aren't very many. They're closing quarries, not opening quarries. And so a lot of our good limestone comes out of Mexico and British Columbia. So it's actually self-financing. Okay, before I go any more, I love this picture to remind us it's about the kids. It's not about the numbers. I love their faces. My grandkids are only 2, so in another 3 years, this is going to really ring true for me. Okay, getting towards the end here. What does it look like when we succeed? So this graph is CO2 is emissions. And the top blue line is the Paris goal, is reducing emissions by about 80% by 2050, right? This was agreed in 2015 and hasn't really changed. We're talking about doing more carbon removal so we can get to net zero. But as you saw in the previous graph, net zero is playing Russian roulette with our kids, and that's just not moral. That's just not right. What we need to do is have the UN change their goal, so we're going to zero warming. And I'll show you that graph in just a second. So the pink is the CO2 removal using the ocean iron fertilization. They also call it ocean restoration. And you can see it being scaled up pretty rapidly. The cost of doing it is about $1 million per eddy. And we need 500 eddies. So it's about $500 million a year in raw costs. The cost of the iron is, what is it, about $80,000, something like that. The cost of the diesel fuel for the ship is about $250,000, and the staff, the crew is another $500,000 for the time required, and then some for the scientific data. So it's easy to scale. It's exactly what nature does. They've done 13 tests and they've never found any bad side effects. There have been lots of theories. People make a lot of money writing papers saying, well, what if something could happen? And saying, there's a popular one from MIT where saying, well, if you do a lot of iron in the Southern Ocean, that could rob nutrients, possibly if you ignore the zooplankton, from the North Sea. It's like, what? From the if you do iron fertilization north of near the Antarctica, that's going to affect the North Sea. And how long is that going to take? 1,000 years? Anyway, so there's a lot of theoretical stuff discussed. In practice, we've talked with all the scientists who've done the 13 experiments, and they're clear. They have never seen a bad side effect. They've seen good side effects, like the fish. It turned out they were expecting coho salmon to grow, not the pink salmon. And they also found that the whale population, the killer whales, they had their first whale birth 2 years after the Haida project, because there was all this food for the female whales to give birth. They hadn't had any births in 5 years before that. And then there were, I think, about 5 births 2 years later, which is the gestation period for those whales. Okay, now we're getting to the fun part. Most of you have seen these simulation graphs like this from the IPCC. You can see the top curves. The RCP 2.8 is from 6 years ago, was the best estimate that the UN would give, because they were limited to stabilizing CO2, not restoring it. This one was a more optimistic one from 2 years ago, from 21. This is what we call RCP 0, which means going to zero warming. And the top, and so you can see the history. And I'll start here. You can see Mount Pinatubo, 1991, cooled the planet by about 1/3 or 1/2 of a degree. And you can also see the CO2 stable for that year. People don't talk about it, but we need to talk about it. And so this is the history. And then if we scale up CO2, as I described, that takes us straight to 300 by 2050. You say, how did that happen? Well, it happened because the woman who did this, Shannon Fiume, she adjusted the parameters and told me, okay, if we do 60 gigatons per year removal, then we get here. So it's not coincidence. It was designed this way. Now, what's interesting is she said, well, keep on removing CO2 until 2100, because if you do that, then we get to 0 degrees warming. We get not a half, not 1, not 1.5, not 2. That we're not out to play Russian roulette with our kids. 0, getting it back to what we had for 10,000 years when we had developed agriculture. And I'll just flip through this. This is world population. You'll notice this is exactly the same curve that we have with CO2. Like, why is that? Well, maybe humans put out that CO2, just maybe. This shows that we can restore the population. I don't want to take your time. And the bottom line is, where are we? That what we can do is commit ourselves and our organizations to climate restoration and sustainable population. That's a longer story. But bring in the population that you belong to, especially the Sierra Club, and contribute to the Foundation for Climate Restoration. And I should have updated this for this talk, but I didn't. And with that, I'll take questions because it's getting late.
I would like to ask the first question.
Yes.
And I know that some people are concerned about red tide and algal blooms in the Gulf Coast that have taken oxygen out of the waters. What would you say to those people about ocean fertilization?
Yes, it's a very good question, commonly asked. Can you cause red tide with iron fertilization? The answer is you simply cannot, for two reasons. One is you can only do iron fertilization far from the coast, because the coast has a lot of iron already from coastal runoff. It's 1 million times higher on the coast than it is in the deep ocean. And so the amount of iron that you put in from a dust storm still leaves you 100,000 times lower than you have on the coast. And so you don't produce any of those bad algal blooms. Okay, what else you got for me?
There was a question, will this be recorded? And yes, it is being recorded. Oh, I need to unfreeze the chat. I'm sorry. Okay, y'all can now use chat. So you can bring on the questions.
Bring them on. So while we're waiting for questions, so I'll just repeat the key points. The key point now is everyone wants to restore the climate. Everyone wants to give our children the climate that humans have survived and not play Russian roulette with our kids. Everyone wants that. And what we need to do is, and we know how to do it, it costs almost nothing. And the action for us to take is to get the UN to update their goals from 1990 goals of stabilize to restore and stabilize. And Sierra Club can put its mark in, because when Sierra Club says our members want to restore the climate, they want to give their grandchildren the best possible chance to survive, other organizations will follow, including the United Nations. Okay, what you got for me?
Charlie has a question and he has unmuted.
Okay, Charlie.
Hi there. Yeah, I'm in Houston, and I was wondering if the group has seen a group called Greentown Labs. I've been following them very closely. There are 300 clean tech companies spread between Boston and Houston, and last year they got $120 million worth of VC. Go look at some of their stuff. They have a heavy concentration on carbon removal. Sometimes they're using, one example is the company that is taking some sort of, I'm not exactly sure where they get it, but the raw materials are basically farm output and push and saving it down in the ocean. And they claim that that causes a certain amount of carbon removal, as an example. There's some tech in there that I have not seen before, which is kind of impressive. Anyway, I just wanted to see if anyone had seen that group or has looked at it at all.
Yeah, Charlie, that's a great example. There's, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's every day at least 2 or 3 new carbon tech companies coming up with new ways of storing CO2, and they're important. They earn money for a lot of companies, and sometimes they produce actual CO2 that can be used in industry for making plastics and so on. And but the thing to keep in mind is the scale that they operate at is on the sort of 1 million tons a year. And we need 50,000 times that scale.
No,
Yeah.
I understand the scale
I mean,
problem.
it's both and. The important thing is both and. You got to do both.
Yeah, well, here's another analogy I'd like to throw out and let other people use too. A gun analogy. There's no such thing as a silver bullet. Let's talk about silver buckshot. In other words, throw everything you can at it at once. Anyway,
Yeah.
I like that. I use that gun analogy because I'm from Texas. So anyway, throwing it out there. Okay.
Yeah. And it's a good analogy when you're doing the carbon tech, when you're removing little bits of carbon for industry and so on. At the 50,000 times larger scale you need for climate restoration, we end up using the nature's 2 silver bullets. But it's both and. The trick is to, and I'm not very good yet at this, but I'm learning to really emphasize we got to do all of it. And you want to be very clear the methods that are restoration, the methods that are just that do other things. Okay, Cheryl.
We do have a lot of questions, but one of them I think is worth you talking a little bit more about, and that was from Catherine. Were you going to go more into methane? And I don't think most of the people here have any idea of how to pull methane out of the air.
Oh, good. Okay, good. Thank you. So yeah, Catherine, thank you for asking about methane. So the backstory on the methane is when we discovered the first 3 of these, and Carole Douglis, my co-author, is on the screen now. And when we discovered that we had 3 redundant methods to get all the CO2 back out, to get back to pre-industrial CO2, we were excited. Just, you can imagine, like, we can do this. These are all self-financing. And then in 2019, we read about the big methane bubbles coming out of the permafrost in the Arctic Ocean. And we're reminded that there was a methane burst that extincted 1/3 of the world's species 50 million years ago. And a lot of us read about that. And I think most of us were like me and decided, I'm not going to think about it. It's bigger than I know what to do with. And I hope to God that it happens next century when we have better technology. Well, it started, the burst is happening. So far, it probably won't be big, but probably is not good enough for our kids. So we looked, and the way to remove the methane turns out to be what nature does, which is, you probably know that methane, which is natural gas, what you have, used to cook on your stove, or heat your house with your furnace, that it has a half-life in the atmosphere of about 8 years, 8 or 10 years, which means it just naturally oxidizes in the atmosphere. And the chemicals that do that, we can amplify. And so iron chloride is the main one, and it's very safe. It's used in water treatment, both sewage and clean water treatment, very commonly used, very safe. And but rather than being a sort of 0.1% of the dust in the atmosphere, in the key areas where it would be used, it would be increased by a factor of 10 or 100. And with that, we can double or triple the rate that nature oxidizes the methane. And it's amazingly cost effective to cut the methane level in the whole atmosphere in half. Looks like it'll cost less than $1 billion a year. Now, how you fund it, eventually the government will fund it, but of course the UN has to move first. The UN has to say, our goal is to restore the climate, right? Because right now the government can't do it because the UN says, we're only allowed to stabilize greenhouse gas levels. But we'll get that changed in the next year or two, I'm determined. And then the trick with the iron chloride, or it could be titanium dioxide, which is used in paint all the time, and a lot of other things. But those are both catalysts that take sunlight and use the sunlight to free up a chlorine atom or something else, which then will oxidize the methane, and then do it over and over again. And so the aerosol, the mist of either iron chloride or titanium dioxide would be emitted out of the exhaust from ships, because you want to do it over the ocean, where, first of all, where there's lots of space, but also that's where nature oxidizes methane, is over the ocean for various reasons. And in large part because there's a lot of sunlight there. And so that's the methane story in a nutshell. And I've actually tested it myself and seen the methane level in my lab go down about 4% an hour. So it's very exciting. We haven't gotten funding yet. Again, I'm blaming the UN because people are allowed to do research. They're not allowed to do implementations yet. And we're working on several different angles to change that this year. Okay, so that's the story about methane. Alan.
Okay, I'll move to you shortly, Alan and Cheryl. You too, if you wish, still have a question. I want to ask a couple more from the chat first. Are there any countries thinking of doing this ocean iron fertilization unilaterally?
Unilaterally is a hard question. The ocean is owned by everyone. I'm not an expert in the law of the sea, but what's interesting is even landlocked countries have permission to do things in the ocean. But there are a lot of countries who are interested in doing it. Madagascar is one. Their people are starving to death for many, many reasons. But one of the big reasons is that their fish catch has gone way down. And so by restoring their fishery, they expect to be able to feed 2 or 3 million people a year and avoid about 1 million deaths. Now, is that unilateral or not? I'm not a lawyer, so I can't answer that. And one thing that we're doing is we've created the Climate Restoration Safety and Governance Board to provide open governance, to make sure that every project that's done, but that will measurably restore CO2 or methane, that every one of those projects is safe, is effective, legal, and ethical. And ethical means you have to talk to all the people affected. So the First Nations in the vicinity, the fishermen, right? Because some fishermen, they should all benefit from it. But you have to talk to everyone beforehand. And so we're establishing the organization to make sure that happens. Great question.
Have you talked to former Vice President Al Gore about this?
We have not. And if you can connect us with Carole and I would love to do that.
Okay. Alan, you can unmute and ask your question.
So my question is, what form does the iron have to take? Is it elemental iron? And are you aware of the megatons of red mud waste that's available as a result of the converting bauxite into aluminum oxide to create aluminum? There are literally drying beds full of megatons of this iron compound.
Yeah, Alan, that's great. I'm not an expert, but I've read the reports and talked to the people who've done it, and it's some various forms of iron oxide and iron sulfate, which means more to you than it means to me. They're just names to me. But the funny thing is the total amount needed is about 1 million tons a year, which is like nothing. So basically, for the normal people among us, imagine a steel mill, and you take a little bit of the steel dust they sweep up off the floor each year. One steel mill, that's plenty. That's all the iron that you need for the whole planet. It's that nature is that efficient. Great question.
Okay, here's a question from Amanda. I thought the Pinatubo event resulted in cooling due to the particulates blocking incoming radiation, and the CO2 delay was due in part to at least cooler ocean temps. Can you clarify the role of the other emissions of Pinatubo on the cooling and CO2 patterns?
Another excellent question. Actually, let me just show the graph because it makes it really fast to explain. If I find it. Oh, I know where it is. No, it's going to take me a few seconds. So Mount Pinatubo, as you're correct, that there was the temperature effect. I'm going to talk while I'm finding the slide that you want. Here we go. Okay, so this, you saw this slide earlier where I showed you Mount Pinatubo reduced the temperature, and that's from the dust, like you said. And then the reduction in CO2, some people have said that it's due to CO2 being absorbed in the cooler ocean. That's clearly not the case, because if that were true, then that CO2 would have come back out the next year when the ocean warmed up again. So this is a case where what the question you're asking affects the answer that you get. So yes, so the only plausible, people have also said that the diffuse sunlight from the dust that happened in 1991-92 helped plants grow better. And again, if that were true, then you would expect the next year when the leaves fell and over the next few years, those plants would have died and the CO2 would have gone back into the air, but it was sequestered for at least 2 decades. Great question that I'm glad you asked.
Someone else asked, can you talk to China and India?
No. The issue really is with the UN, and our access to the UN is with groups like the Sierra Club and Congress. Because the reason Madagascar isn't doing this right now is the political issue of like, if we're going to reduce that much CO2, are we going to get attacked by crazies who say that you're not supposed to do it? So once that happens at the UN, that both China and India have done research on iron fertilization, for example.